We're here in the storage facility of the Canadian Canoe Museum in Peterborough. We like to think of it as a canoe cathedral. And we're in the presence of what may be one of the oldest birch bark canoes in the world. We call it the Enys Canoe. This canoe came to the attention of the Canadian Canoe Museum through the National Maritime Museum in Falmouth, England, in the southwestern corner of England, who called to say that a very, very old birch bark canoe had been found in a stone barn in Cornwall, in that area, and that the family of a British soldier called John Enys, who was in Canada in the late 18th century, had discovered this canoe in this barn and called the museum to ask what they should do with it. The National Maritime Museum said, sure, we'd love to see it. They put it on display for a while, and they inquired of the Canadian Canoe Museum in Canada if this is something we might like to keep and take responsibility for, and we said, absolutely. It was often called the world's oldest birch bark canoe. Whether it is or whether it isn't, we don't know. Birch bark canoes were a disposable artifact. But we know we have written documentation on the part of John Enys, the British soldier, that he was here in the late 18th century and actually went home in the 1780s and very likely took this canoe with him. So as far as I know, it's the oldest birch bark canoe I've ever seen as a person who is on the staff here at the Canadian Canoe Museum. The problem, though, was that it was in England, and we tried to bring it back to Canada. It's a difficult thing to bring back to Canada, and it wasn't until we actually put a crew on the Thames River for the Queen's Diamond Jubilee flotilla that we had the capacity, with the help of the Canadian government and the Canadian military, to bring the Enys canoe back in a box. She was welcomed by, well, I should say, by the look and by the places where John Enys spent time in Canada, in Quebec and Upper New York State. We know that it is a birch bark canoe of Eastern origin. Whether it has Maliseet or Mi'kmaq or Penobscot or Mohawk influence, we really don't know, because we just don't know who made it. But it is an incredible example of a craft from that period, and we're very excited about having it here. Without knowing exactly where it came from, we invited a number of Indigenous friends and elders to come and welcome it, and we had a two-part ceremony to welcome it here to the museum. The first part was private, led by Elder Doug Williams from Curve Lake First Nation. It's a Mississauga nation that's the closest to us, one of them that's closest to us here in Peterborough. And they sang welcome songs quietly, privately, here inside the museum. And then later, in a wonderful service or ceremony, we welcomed the canoe with a bigger group of people and told the story as we knew it. But I really just want to show you some of the features, because it's very similar to the Galway canoe in the sense that it's very old and it's recently come to Canada. Different than the Galway canoe or the grandfather Aquitaine canoe, this one's had a hard day at the office. From a curatorial point of view, that's very exciting, because if the canoe were whole, there would be things that we could not see, that we can see, regarding its make, the type of materials, how it's put together when it's in this kind of, let's call it, expanded format. But inside the format, and we have decided for now simply to clean and stabilize the canoe rather than try to bring it back to any kind of semblance of what it once was. But the exciting thing about this canoe is that we are able to see layers of ingenuity and human intention going right back to the building, which might have been going back to mid-18th century. And interestingly, inside the craft, we see the knife marks, the tool marks of the original maker. We see the wattup, that is the split conifer root that's on holding this together. And we see the splits, we see the bark, we see the original makings But interestingly, and we think perhaps it went back to John Ennis's estate, and we think that it may have been used as kind of a party vessel, or some used after it went to England, because there are actually battens of wood, a keelson on the inside that's actually fixed to the canoe with square nails that you would never have seen in the original making. Some of the gunwale furnishings are actually tacked on with metal fixtures, possibly square nails. You can actually see a square nail right here that may have come later, probably not part of the original making. Probably one of the most interesting things about this canoe is that someone has lovingly repaired the stems, this area here, and the ends of the canoe in a way that is just ingenious. We actually have real birch bark here with the gores, the cuts that would have been sealed with a mixture of spruce gum and bear flat, possibly a little carbon in there. You can see the little check marks or the lines, the lenticels on the bark here. And then as you move to the end of the canoe, you actually think that this is still bark, but in fact, it's canvas sewn on over some sort of repair with the lenticels painted on. Here's a bit of a knot on here, and you actually have gores painted in, probably gores where there wouldn't have been on the original, although we don't know that because we haven't looked underneath. An ingenious repair job. So what we're looking at is a kind of a palimpsest of history, a kind of layer upon layer upon layer of history in one living document. Unlike the canoe from Galway, the grandfather Aquitaine canoe, that is much more identifiably Maliseet, both by geographic origin and also by design and shape. This canoe is yet to find its place in geography and in the sort of cultural map of Eastern North America. But it's one we're very, very excited about, very similar to the Galway canoe. But the strategy for this one, much like the Galway canoe, eventually we would love to make a replica of this, to take the dimensions, which we'll have to estimate here because, as you can see, the canoe has kind of relaxed, the bark has relaxed, the thwarts are gone, which would have determined the width of the canoe. But we know it was something in the order of 6.8 meters, something like that long. And we'd like to make a replica, much the same way Kim and Wayne Brooks and the people in St. Mary's First Nation made a replica of the grandfather Aquitaine canoe so that they could work their traditions, relearn the traditions that way. We're hoping to do something similar here. And in the end, really what we want to do for now is research it, study it, find funds in order to do that here at the museum, and to learn what we can about this because it's a unique part of the history of North America with an incredibly great story, much like the canoe that found its way to Galway and back to Canada not too very long ago.